Hi everybody, Schling here. Today we'll be talking about inheritance and the prototype chain in JavaScript. I'll also show you ways to write objects that inherit from prototype. So let's get right into it. First of all, what is inheritance? Inheritance is the process where an object gains properties and methods from another object, usually through the prototype chain. What is prototype? A prototype is an object that other objects inherits properties and methods from. So a prototype can be said as a blueprint of objects. Now, every object has an internal link to an object called its prototype. And that prototype has a prototype of its own. And that prototype also has a prototype of its own. And that prototype of that prototype has a prototype of its own until a null value is reached. By definition, a null value has no prototype. And so when you reach a null value, that's the end of the prototype chain. All right, so now let's get into it. Let's write some examples and see how object inherits from prototypes. All right. So let's define a variable called obj in global memory and assign it an object literal. Let's give it a property a and assign it a value of 1. And now let's set the prototype of this object manually. To set it manually, we use a property name called __proto__. So let's go. Let's set its value to an object literal. Let's give it a property name of b and a value of 2. So this is it, just very simple. This is how to make an object inherit from a prototype. This is just one way. To check the prototype of an object, we could let's console.log this. We could use this function called object.get prototype of obj. Now let's run this code. Let's say oops. Oh, sorry. Let's run this code. You see that we get the prototype of b, a property name of b and 2, and that's the object in the prototype of the object that inherits it. So the prototype of this object is b, is a property b and a value 2. Okay, so this is just one way to make an object inherits from a prototype. We could also write in this same way. We could also write another way in this same way. We could just say let's declare another variable. Let's call it parent in global memory. Let's assign it an object literal. let's give it a property name A and a value of 1. Let's also declare another variable in global memory. Let's call it child. Assign it object literal. Let's give it a value let's give a property name B and a value of 2, just like the previous example. And now let's set the prototype of the child. Let's make the child object inherit from the parent object by using the same underscore prototype underscore proto sorry underscore proto underscore property. Let's give it a value of the parent object. So just as simple as that. Now this child object inherits from this parent object. We could let's console.log it and see. We could see this child object has an own property of B with a value 2, but doesn't have an own property of A with a value 1. But let's console.log child.a and see if we could get the value of A in child. So here we go. Child.log A. Let's run our code. It's 1. We get a value of 1, but we don't see a value of 1 here. When we search for the property A in this child object, it looks into its own variable. It doesn't find A as its own variable. It then looks into its prototype. Then there it finds the A that it inherits from the parent object. So this is one way of setting the prototype of an object. This is a manual way of doing it. Now let me give you another example. Now let's use a factory function. By default, a factory function is a function that returns an object anytime you call it. So anytime you call it, it returns a new object. Anytime you call it, it returns a new object. Anytime you call it, it returns a new object over and over again. So let's create a factory function. Let's call it, let's say, okay, function. Let's call it person. So we are defining a function called person in global memory. We are passing it a parameter name and score. Now let's build the body of this function. Let's declare a variable. So cons new user. Let's assign it an empty object. Now let's build the properties of this object. New user dot name is equal to name, the value name. So we get a value from the arguments we pass into this function when we call it at a later time. Let's give it a score property and assign it a score value. Let's also create a method called increment that will increment the score. Let's increment. So we are creating an increment method. Let's increment the score by 1 anytime you call the increment method. And now, as I said earlier, a factory function always returns a new object. So let's return our object. Now let's create a new instance of this person function. Let's call it person1. So let's declare a person variable 1. Oh, let me change this to a small letter p. Usually the first letter is capitalized for constructors and then for class. We'll get into that later on. So const person1. Let's assign it the evaluated value of calling the person function. So person, and then let's pair the parameters with arguments. So let's give it a name called, let's say, OZ. So we pass in an OZ argument and then a 1 as a value for score. So OZ as a name, 1 for score, 1 for the value of score. And now let's see if the person1 variable inherits the person1 inherits from the person function. Let's check whether the person1 inherits from the person function. So let's console.log person1. Let's run our code. As you can see, person1 has names set to OZ, score set to 1, and has an increment method, which is a function. So anytime we create an instance, we get this object, a new object. But the problem here is that assuming we are just creating 1, 2, 3, or just 4 instances from this person function, we do not have a problem. But assuming we are creating like a million instances from this person function, the problem here is that anytime we create an instance, we create a new copy of this increment function. And that is not efficient. That means that we will use a lot of memory. Instead of us just referencing to the increment method, we are creating a new copy anytime we create a new instance. So a better way to improve this is to use a prototypal inheritance. And so let me show you how that is done. So we would remove the increment method from this function. So let's create a new variable called user methods in global memory. Assign it object literal. Let's create our increment method here. this dot score plus plus, and then let's take this method off from this factory function. And now let's make the user method the prototype of this person object. Of this new user object. To do that, we use a function called object.create and pass in the user method object. Let me just call it user method. Yeah. So object dot create, and then we pass in our object called user method. What this function does is that it makes this user method a prototype of new user. That means a new user will now inherit the increment method. And so it inherits from this increment method. So now let's check the prototype of person 1 to see if it's equal to the prototype user method. And this can be achieved by doing this person 1, which is the instance we created. Object dot get prototype of the person instance equal to user method. This is how you check to see if indeed the user method is the prototype of the new user object. So let's run our code. True. If it wasn't true, we would have gotten a false value here. Okay, so another way of setting the prototype of an object is by using the object.create function. This is another way. Aside from using the __proto___, another way to set the prototype of an object or to make an object inherit from a prototype is by using object.create function, and then you pass in the object you would want it to inherit from. As you may by now know, JavaScript implements prototypal inheritance or inheritance by using objects. Okay, so now let me show you another way of making an object inherit from a prototype. And this time we use a constructor function. I made mention of that earlier on. So let's create our constructor function. Let's call it person. So what we are doing is that we are defining a constructor function called person, and we are passing it a parameter name and score. So we define this in global memory. Now let's set it up. Now this is how we set a prototype of a constructor function. Person dot, you use a prototype keyword, dot, let's give it a method, let's use the same increments method we used earlier on. Let's increment the score by 1. Now let's create a new instance of let's create a new instance of the person constructor function. So let's say we define a new variable called person1, like we did previously. We assign it the evaluated value of calling the constructor function. So we use the new keyword person function. We pass in, now we pair the parameters and the arguments. So we pass in a name with a value of z, and a score with a value 1. And now let's console.log person1. Let's see what we get. Let me just switch this terminal to bash. Get to bash. All right. Okay, I like this. Should we just continue using the bash? Yeah, the bash looks anyway. The bash looks a little longer, but anyway. I mean, the PowerShell looks a little longer, but anyway, let's run our code. We get a name. Oh, yeah, I should have made a property here. Score. Okay, so let's run our code again. So we get a name with a value of 0, score with a value of 1. Let's try increment the score to person1. As you can see, the increment method is the prototype. Is a prototype of the. You can be finding a prototype of the person1 object, but it's not visible here. You could only see the own values or own properties that it inherited from the person constructor. But because as you can see, we can see the increment method here. But let's try calling the increment method. Let's use try to increment the score and see if it will work. Usually the prototype of the object is hidden. You don't see it when you console.log it. But I'll show you a way to find out the prototype of an object like we did in the previous one. So let's say person.1 dot increment. Let's go to increment function here. And you know, in JavaScript, anytime you call a function, you create a new evaluation, a new what's it called? Execution context. Anytime you call a function or you invoke a function or you call a function, you execute you what you execute you how's it record a new evaluation context. It's Anytime you call a function, you create a new execution context. That's the word. Yeah, that's JavaScript for you. So let's see if it increments um, our score. So you can see we get a score of 2 here. Let me just clear this console. Okay. So now to find the prototype of person 1, we could do this. This is how we find the prototype of person 1. Object dot get prototype of the you pass it the instance we created. Person 1 is equal to the constructor function is person dot prototype keyword. And we get a true. So that means that the prototype of person 1 is this method here, increment function. It inherits from this constructor function. Okay, so I was saying anytime you call you call a function in JavaScript to create a new execution context. That nearly escaped me. Okay, let me show you another way of making an object inherit from a prototype. Now we are going to use the class function. Class. Let's give it a name, person, like we did before, and the earlier ones. And then let's set it up. It's just similar to the constructor function. It's very similar to the constructor function, but with little syntax. So we pass it a name parameter and a score parameter. As you can already see, it's just similar to the constructor function. Then now this is how we create a prototype. You remember in the constructor function we did passing the prototype.increment, but in the class function, look at how it's written. Very short syntax, very simple syntax. No increment dot prototype. Oh, sorry, no person dot prototype dot increment. You can then assign it to no. This is how it's just done. Just simple. So a class function makes the you setting the prototype very simple. So let's create an instance of the class function. So create a variable in global memory. Let's call it person1 as usual. Let's assign it to the evaluated results of calling the person class. Let's pass in OZ as a name value. And a score of 1. So let's console.log our person1. Let's make sure at least we inherit its the person class own properties. And boom, here we have it. Name property with a value of z, score with a value of 1. Now let's try to increment the score. You can see we can't see the increment property, the increment method here, but then it's in its prototype. So let's see if indeed it has inherited from this person class. And so we say, so we are trying to see whether indeed the person1 instance has inherited from this person class. Yeah, from this person class. So let's do person1 dot increment. Okay, let's run our code again. Yeah, we can see that we have a score incremented to 2. And now let's check the prototype of person1. And just like before, this is how we check it. Oops, sorry. This is how we check it. Object dot get prototype of person1. We pass in the instance we created, and then person dot prototype. And now let's run our code. Boom, we get true. So indeed, this person1 has inherited from this person class. So now we can build more features in this person1 instance, and then we use the properties and the methods of the existing object or the existing person class here, without necessarily always creating the increment method or creating this own properties of this person class. Okay, so thanks for watching. This is some few ways, or these are the ways of making an object inherit from um, from a prototype. Thank you. Thank you for watching. Bye.